Hi, I'm Jenny, and I'm gonna go over chapters 3 and 4 of Sinclair Lewis's "It Can't Happen Here." Um, as a as a review, chapter 2 was the after party uh, at Tasbro's house, and they had discussed a lot of reasons why electing a fascist president or a fascist government could happen in the United States, and reasons why it can't. And pretty sure the reasons why it could were really one, as far as uh, if you put them up against each other, as far as Doremus's argument. But chapter 3 is more of a fun chapter. It introduces Doremus as a person, and his family, and and it and I think that the reason why it goes so much in depth to Doremus and his family is because it's going to contrast him as kind of original American uh, culture against Buzz Windrip, who was kind of a schwindler, uh, from based on his upbringing and his education and his lack of talents. Uh, but starts out with introducing Doremus's parents. So his dad was uh, was a reverend. He was a Universalist pastor. And Doremus was born in 1876. His mom says was no less than a Bass of Massachusetts. So I looked that up, and um, the Bass name in Massachusetts is a really old name, and her dad was, or there, it's a line of Episcopal pastors. Um, so she comes from that line, and it says that he was basically raised in a parsonage. That's where he did his schooling, because back then there weren't public schools back then, so really only people who had access to books and educated parents got an education. But it says that when he was a kid, he was educated in a parsonage, and he said there was little meat, but plenty of books, not all theological by any means, so that before he was 12, Doremus knew the profane writings of Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, Jane Austen, Tennyson, Byron, Keats, Shelley, Tolstoy, and Balzac. Um, he graduated from Isaiah College, once a bold Unitarian venture, but by 1894 an interdenominational outfit with nebulous Trinitarian yearnings, a small and rustic stable of learning in North Fort Beulah, 13 miles from the fort. Um, so I think that means that it was like kind of like a Protestant versus Catholics kind of thing. Um, Basically, they looked at the Episcopal was kind of like one of the original churches in the United States, in America, before it became the United States. But Trinitarian means that basically it has it's more toward uh, interdenominational, and uh, also it says that he was an incurable book addict, but a fair track athlete, uh, and he went to college, and then after college, he he wrote a short story in the Century talking about authors like Dickens, um, And in 1901, 3 years after his graduation from college, when his widowed father left him $2,980 and his library, Doremus went home to Fort Beulah and bought a quarter interest in the Informer, then a weekly. So he took this paper and he turned it into a daily, and by 1936 he owned the whole paper. But it was just a small town paper. He was a good reporter, and I think this is where the concept of reporters and media comes into the book, because there's another contrast here between Doremus as a investigative reporter, who who basically prided himself on uh, fair stories and gave a chance to both sides, against Buzz Windrip's Vice, guy who was running as his Vice. He was also a reporter for a big um, newspaper, and he was extremely corrupt. We'll it'll introduce him in chapter 4. So then Doremus got. It says he was the third cousin of Calvin Coolidge, who had considered him sound domestically but loose politically. Doremus considered himself just the opposite. And then his wife, he married his wife Emma out of Fort Beulah. She was the daughter of a wagon manufacturer, a placid, prettyish, broad-shouldered girl with whom he had gone to high school. And then they had 3 children. Philip, who was the oldest, he went to Dartmouth and Harvard Law School, and he had ended up settling in Worcester and practicing law. Mary, who married a doctor in Fort Beulah, and her name's Mary Fowler. And then Sissy, who's Cecilia. She's the young one. She's 18, and she still lives at home, and she's basically the light of their life. Uh, and then it describes each character, each of the children and his wife in detail, along with the people who worked at his house. So his wife, Emma Jessup, warmly generous, a cordon bleu at making lemon meringue pie, a parochial Tory, an Orthodox Episcopalian, and completely innocent of any humor. So a parochial Tory means that she was basically still English at heart. Um, and then his gardener, Shad, Canuck, an Irish Canuck peasant, large, red-faced, sulky, and surly, and he always did things really sloppy. He didn't edge, and he left his equipment everywhere for people to trip over, and he constantly cursed his gardener under his breath, but then he never fired him. And then they had a maid too, um, Mrs. Candy, and she also was a cook. Um, doesn't really describe her very much, except that he doesn't let her go in his office to clean it. Um, and it describes their house. Their house was an ample white clapboarded structure of the vintage of 1880, a square bulk and mansard roof. In front, a long porch with insignificant square white pillars. Doremus declared that the house was ugly, but ugly in a nice way. And then this is kind of my favorite part of the book so far, where it describes his study. And I love reading about people's offices and the content they have in there, because that's your personal intellectual development, your personal intellectual um, journey in millennial terms. Uh, so his study up there was one perfect refuge from annoyances and bustle. It was the only room in the house that Mrs. Candy quiet, grimly competent, thoroughly literate, once a Vermont country school teacher, was never allowed to clean. It was an endearing mess of novels, copies of the Congressional Record, of the New Yorker, Time Nation, New Republic, New Masses, and Speculum, cloistral organ of the medieval society. Treatises on taxation and monetary systems, road maps, volumes on exploration and Abyssinia and the Antarctic, chewed stubs of pencils, a shaky portable typewriter, fishing tackle, rumpled carbon paper, two comfortable old leather chairs, a Windsor chair at his desk, and the complete works of Thomas Jefferson. His chief hero, a microscope and a collection of Vermont butterflies, Indian arrowheads, exiguous exiguous volumes of Vermont village poetry printed in local newspaper offices, the Bible, the Koran, the Book of Mormon, science and health selections from Mahabharata, the poetry of Sandburg, Frost, Masters, Jeffers, Ogden, Nash, Edgar Guest, Omar, Omar Khayyam, and Milton, a shotgun and a .22 repeating rifle, an Isaiah College banner, faded, the complete Oxford Dictionary, five fountain pens, of which two would work, a vase from Crete dating back to 327 BC, very ugly. The World Almanac for the year before last, with the cover suggesting that it had been chewed by a dog, odd pairs of horn-rimmed spectacles, and rimless eyeglasses, none of which now suited his eyes, a fine, reputedly Tudor oak cabinet from Devonshire, portraits of Ethan Allen and Thaddeus Stevens, rubber wading boots, senile red Morocco slippers, a poster issued by the Vermont Mercury at Woodstock on September 2nd, 1840, announcing a glorious Whig victory, 24 boxes of safety matches, one by one stolen from the kitchen, assorted yellow scratch pads, 7 books on Russia and Bolshevism, extraordinarily pro or extraordinarily con, a signed photograph of Theodore Roosevelt, 6 cigarette cartons, all half empty according to the tradition of journalistic eccentrics. Doremus should have smoked a good old pipe, but he detested the slimy ooze of nicotine-soaked spittle. I read that wrong. It says 6 cigarette cartons, all half empty. According to the tradition of journalistic eccentrics, Doremus should have smoked a good old pipe, but he detested the slimy ooze of nicotine-soaked spittle. A rag carpet on the floor, a withered sprig of holly, and a silver Christmas ribbon. A case of 7 unused genuine Sheffield razors, dictionaries in French, German, Italian, and Spanish, the first of which languages he could really read, a canary in a Bavarian gilded wicker cage, a worn linen-bound copy of old Hearthside songs for home and picnic, whose selections he was wont to croon, holding the book on his knee, and an old cast-iron Franklin stove. Everything indeed that was proper for a hermit and improper for impious domestic hands. So, I this is where I would like to use this section of the book describing his office to stress to anyone who's watching this, or to anyone that I would be teaching in the future. Uh, work Develop your own home library, because you don't have to live in a house to have a library. Instead of buying technology and things that everyone else is buying, find what books that you want to read and buy those. Libraries are selling their books for really cheap because people use ebooks now, and personally I think that books are one of the best investments because they they contain so many valuable lessons. Like, a lot of these people who write these old books, they had a lot of faults. And that's one of the things that people are stressing right now, especially in academia, is basically to throw out the teachings or the writings of people because they're supremacist or it's hegemony, things like that. But the thing is, even though these people, a lot of these old writers and things had tendencies to go with mob mentality of the time, they did have talent, and that's why their writings still exist, because there's nuggets of wisdom in there, and our job is to retain those and refine them. The job of future generations get is to go through this stuff and to find the good things and take them, throw out the bad stuff, and take the good stuff and refine it, because otherwise it could never be created again. Or we could lose that, we could lose that knowledge and never get it again, because what's the one thing that everyone says whenever you talk about history is those who are those who don't know history are destined to repeat it, because you don't know the pitfalls, you don't know how things were, you don't know the intricacies of daily life of the time. And it's imperative to know these things, because otherwise you don't have a significant and valid filter in your mind to see reality. And you have to develop your filter, because if you don't develop your filter of seeing reality, then you can fall prone to going with what everyone else wants to do, going with what everyone else says is right at the time. So there's value in these things. There's value in traditions. Um, just find the value and retain it, because a lot of these things, a lot of the traditions that we've thrown out were refined over thousands of years, and now no one follows them. So you have to look at it and ask yourself, why would they keep it around? Why would they keep refining it? And that's because there's some value in it. So anyway, he Mrs. Candy, the maid, she puts his mail outside of his office on a long table. So he picked up the mail. This is after the party. He's sitting in his office, and there's a letter to him from one of the professors at his old college, Isaiah College. And this professor is Dr. Loveland, teacher of Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. And he wrote to Doremus Jessup about a dangerous situation that has arisen at the college. Basically, the college was becoming militarized, and students were uh, undergoing drilling with rifles and machine guns, um, drafting up blueprints and studying blueprints of military equipment. And they weren't reading the the old historical things that they were supposed to be taking in their classes, and they were getting college credits for military training. So basically, they could get through the whole program without learning what they were supposed to be learning. And so he sits there and thinks about it, and then he lets his dog in the office, and his dog is really cute. It describes his dog. It's funny how the dogs are always the ones that have. It almost seems like the dogs have more common sense than people sometimes. But says he opened the door to admit Foolish, the family dog. Foolish was a reliable combination of English setter, Airedale, Cocker Spaniel, Wistful Doe, and Rearing Hyena. And it describes Foolish more later in the book, and then he fell asleep in his chair. So the chapter four is Buzz Windrip, Senator Berzelius Windrip. He's the basically the guy who is running that's hiding his fascism, and he's going to give a radio speech. So everyone's waiting to hear him speak. So everyone is sitting there waiting for the time when his speech starts on the radio. And I'm going to read his speech. Well, I'll read him. I'll read Doremus describing who Buzz Windrip is. Few men doubted that the Democratic candidate would be that skyrocket, Senator Berzelius Windrip. That is to say, Windrip as the mask and bellowing voice, with his satanic secretary, Lee Sarason, as the brain behind. Lee Sarason is the journalist. Senator Windrip's father was a small town Western druggist, equally ambitious and unsuccessful, and had named him Berzelius after the Swedish chemist. So back then, there were also a lot of ideas about uh, druggists, or now that it would be a pharmacist, but back then they would sell tonics at like, you know, uh, events that would be occurring. They would travel and sell tonics. And so a lot of people didn't respect him at all, because a lot of them would just like sell, alcohol as a tonic, and make a whole bunch of money on it. So that was his dad. That was Buzz's dad. Usually he was known as Buzz. He had worked his way through a Southern Baptist college of approximately the same academic standing as a Jersey City Business College, and through a Chicago law school, and settled down to practice in his native state to enliven local politics. He was a tireless traveler, a boisterous and humorous speaker, an inspired guesser at what political doctrines the people would like, a warm handshaker, and willing to lend money. He drank Coca-Cola with the Methodists, beer with the Lutherans, California white wine with the Jewish village merchants, and when they were safe from observation, white mule corn whiskey with all of them. So he didn't have a really good education, and he was really just almost 100% um, personality. Uh, within 20 years, he was an absolute ruler of his state, as ever a sultan was of Turkey. He was never governor. He had shrewdly seen that his reputation for research among planters, punch recipes, varieties of poker, and the psychology of girl stenographers might cause his defeat by the church people. So he had contented himself with coaxing to the gubernatorial shearing a trained lamb of a country schoolmaster, whom he had gaily led on a wide blue ribbon. The state was certain that he had given it a good administration, and they knew that it was Buzz Windrip who was responsible, not the governor. So basically, he had they had a figurehead as a governor. Um, Windrip caused the building of impressive high roads and the consolidated country roads. He made the state buy tractors and combines and lend them to the farmers at cost. He was certain that someday America would have vast business dealings with Russians, and though he detested all Slavs, he made the state university put in the first course in Russian language that had been known in all that part of the West. His most original invention was a quadrupling of the state militia and rewarding the best soldiers in it with training in agriculture, aviation, and radio and automobile engineering. The militiamen considered him their general and their god. And when the state attorney general announced that he was going to have Windrip indicted for having grafted $200,000 of tax money, The militia rose to Buzz Windrip's orders as they were his private army, and occupying the legislative chambers and all the state offices, covering the streets leading to the Capitol with machine guns, they herded Buzz's enemies out of town. He took the United States senatorship as though it were his manorial right, and for 6 years his only rival as the most bouncing and feverish man in the state had been the late Huey Long of Louisiana. He preached the comforting gospel of so redistributing wealth that every person in the country would have several $1,000s a year. Monthly, Buzz changed his prediction as to how many thousand, while all the rich men were nevertheless to be allowed enough to get along on the maximum of $500,000 a year. So everybody was happy in the prospect of Windrip's becoming president. The Reverend Dr. Ederson Schmel, Dean of St. Agnes Cathedral, San Antonio, Texas, stated once in a sermon, once in the slightly variant mimeographed press handout on the sermon, and 7 times in interviews, that Buzz's coming to the power would be like the heaven-blessed fall of reviving rain upon a parched and thirsty land. Dr. Schmel, Dr. Schemmel did not say anything about what happened when the blessed rain came and kept falling steadily for 4 years. So I think that's one of the throughout history uh, common factors of a fascist is or of a fascist regime is that people have like a lot of feelings about them, and they like almost worship that person, and they feel like they're sent by God. There's a lot of like religious type of worship behind that person. It it was said that he had been born in Georgia, in Minnesota on the east side of New York, in Syria, and that he was pure Yankee Jewish Charleston Huguenot. It was known that he had been singularly reckless lieutenant of machine gunners as a youngster during the Great War, and that he had stayed over ambling about Europe for 3 or 4 years, and he had worked on the Paris edition of the New York Herald, nibbled at painting and at black magic in Florence and Munich. Oh, I'm sorry. Now we're talking about Sarason. Sarason is the journalist. No one, even among Washington correspondents, seemed to know precisely how much a part in Senator Windrip's career was taken by his secretary, Lee Sarason. When Windrip had first seized power in his state, Sarason had been a managing editor of the most widely circulated paper in all that part of the country. Sarason's genius was and remained a mystery. It was said that he had been born in Georgia, in Minnesota, on the east side of New York, in Syria, and he was pure Yankee, Jewish, Charleston Huguenot. It was known that he had been singularly reckless lieutenant of machine gunners as a youngster during the Great War, and that he stayed over ambling about Europe for 3 or 4 years and worked on the Paris edition of the New York Herald, nibbled at painting and at black magic in Florence and Munich, and had a few sociological months at the London School of Economics, associated with decidedly curious people in arty Berlin, night restaurants. Returned home, Sarason had become decidedly the hard-boiled reporter of the shirt-sleeved tradition, who asserted that he would rather be called a prostitute than anything so sissified as a journalist. But it was suspected that nevertheless he still retained the ability to read. He had been variously a socialist and an anarchist. Even in 1936, there were rich people who asserted that Sarason was too radical, but actually he had lost his trust, if any, in the masses during the hoggish nationalism after the war, and he believed now only in resolute control by a small oligarchy. In this he was a Hitler, a Mussolini. Sarason was lank, lanky and drooping, with thin flaxen hair and thick lips and a bony face. His eyes were sparks at the bottom of two dark wells. In his long hands there was a bloodless strength. He used to surprise persons who were about to shake hands with him by suddenly bending their fingers back until they almost broke. Most people didn't much like it. As a newspaper man, he was an expert of the highest grade. He could smell out a husband murderer, the grafting of a politician, that is to say, of a politician belonging to a gang opposed by his paper, the torture of animals or children, and in this last story, he liked to write himself rather than hand it to a reporter. And when he did write it, you saw the moldy cellar, heard the whip, and felt the slimy blood. Compared with Lee Sarason as a newspaperman, little Doremus Jessup of Fort Beulah was like a village parson. Compared with the $20,000 minister of a 20-story New York institutional tabernacle with radio affiliations. Senator Windrip had made Sarason officially his secretary, but he was known to be much more: bodyguard, ghostwriter, press agent, economic advisor, and in Washington, Lee Sarason became the man most consulted and least liked by the newspaper correspondents in the whole Senate office building. Windrip was a young 48 in 1936, Sarason an aged and sagging-cheeked 41. Okay, so um, here's one of, it says, perhaps the most familiar, most quoted paragraph of Zero Hour, which was a bibliography about Windrip that Sarason wrote called Zero Hour Over the Top. When I was a little, so this is an excerpt from the book that Sarason wrote about Windrip. When I was a little shaver back in the cornfields, we kids used to just wear one-strap suspenders on our pants, and we called them galluses on our breeches. But they held them up and saved our modesty just as much as if we put a high-toned limey accent and talked about braces and trousers. That's how the whole world of what they called scientific economics is like. The Marxians think that by writing of galluses and braces, they've got something that knocks the stuffings out of the old-fashioned ideas of Washington and Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Well, and all, I sure believe in using every new economic discovery like they have been worked out in the so-called fascist countries like Italy and Germany and Hungary and Poland, yes, by thunder, and even in Japan. We probably will have to lick those little yellow men someday to keep them from pinching our vested and rightful interests in China. But don't let that keep us from grabbing of any smart ideas that those cute little beggars have worked out. I want to stand on my hind legs and not just admit, but frankly holler right out that we've got to change our system a lot. Maybe even change the whole Constitution, but change it legally and not by violence. To bring it up from the horseback and corduroy road epic to the automobile and cement highway period of today. The executive has got to have a freer hand and be able to move quickly in an emergency and not be tied down by a lot of dumb shyster lawyer congressmen, but taking months to shoot off their mouths in debate. And it's a butt as Deacon Checkerboard's hay barn. And it's a butt as big as Deacon Checkerboard's hay barn back home. These new economic changes are only a means to an end, and that end is and must be fundamentally the same principles of liberty, equality, and justice that we were advocated by the founding fathers of this great land back in 1776. So basically he said so many contradicting things in this this last statement that it basically equals everything. It basically negates everything that he said. All of his points were it was just something to pique people's interest and to, like right now, we have a lot of things going on that are just sound bites, and short little videos and memes that don't really fully have a logical or intellectual meaning or thought, but they're just designed to influence our opinions. So we have to think these things through, and we have to identify what makes sense and what doesn't. Um, so did he do it? Yeah. So that basically is what happened. Is describes the rival. It describes um, Buzz's rival uh, in uh, the election, and it's just kind of like going on and on about those concepts for the rest of chapter 4. But next week I'll try to do 3 chapters. But thank you so much for listening today, and have a good day.